So today we're looking at the second part of the sixth lecture in the winter 1931 term. We ended last time with the idea that in the Eastern traditions there exists the depiction of the Mandala, which is at the center a union of opposites surrounded by circles and squares of various ways to keep the individual, if we use the language of Christiana's vision, as the tree in the center, away from the fiery passions on the outside of the magic circle of the individual. So recall the individual sits in the collective unconscious, and it's this magic circle that separates it from kind of the chaos of the totality of the thoughts and images of the hypostasis, what Jung calls the collective unconscious, which must, we reasoned, have a personal structure. So this was a kind of a fun part of this lecture where a Greek philosopher who was working at Harvard had traveled to Zurich to hear these lectures. And George Demos, I think, a professor of philosophy. And when Jung talks about how we ended last time, remember, with the idea that the individual breaks the kind of placid animal harmony with consciousness. And so Demos says, yes, but what is that principle or force that breaks the harmony between animal and God? He wants to say something like, what is the force of disruption or unsettledness? And ultimately says, and this is, he gets in kind of an argument with Jung about this, where Jung finally says it's the spirit of Lucifer. So Demos is saying, of course, from the sort of Christian side of things, that what Jung is suggesting is that the individual is Luciferic, and Jung says, yes, yes. If you read some of Jung's other work, this is incredibly important insofar as we talked last time, this certain idea of Gnosticism, whereby there are two equal and opposite competing forces within the structure of nature, evil and good. Christ is an incomplete symbol of the self in the Christian tradition because it fails to contain evil. And for Jung, a lot of what he's trying to do is, within his metaphysics, work out the possibility that evil is inherent in the Godhead. Right? So this is the idea is, how can the West understand the notion of God's judgment and punishment if at the same time it holds the conditions of divinity as being kind of omnibenevolent and these kinds of things? So Jung works on this notion that evil is in the Godhead, and we must consider the possibility that God is both good and evil. I think one way to reconcile this with the Western tradition, if you don't want to accept this sort of, right, in the same way that Jung criticizes Christianity for imposing a transcendental order onto things, right, with the appearance of the Christ, this certain revelation of the possibility of knowledge, essentially of the truth. Jung also wants to neglect the possibility of the a priori revelation of knowledge, and he wants to work out from first principles. And the way he works out from first principles is by saying that I will not assume, this is his premise, I will not assume there is good and evil, or I will not assume that good is better than evil, essentially, and so let me put evil in the Godhead and see what happens. We can see something similar with Jacob Boehme, that philosopher, theosophist of the 16th century, who is quite ridiculed and ignored to a large extent and avoided a lot in theological discussions, who also had this notion of God as this uncontrolled creative force conditioned only by the nature of Christ, who tempers God's uncontrollable power, and in so doing essentially reconciles good with evil and love with chaos. Okay, so that's a lot to say that there was kind of this tussle between Demos and Jung around the nature of good and evil. Demos wanting to preserve some notion of the inherent betterness of good, and Jung not willing to concede that good and evil are distinguishable or can be ordered in some hierarchy of value. And this will come into play towards the end when we get to more of Christiana's vision, where she wrestles with this same problem. Okay, so a little bit more about the mandala. He talks about how the mandala is the The purpose of the mandala is to depotentiate the chaotic passions and the influence of the outside world. If one can de-identify with those things and become the union of opposites in the center, the tree for Christiana Morgan, the notion of the spiritual life that grows towards the sun, that transcendence is the process of the entirety of the life course. The mandala represents the means by which one can interact in the world and also withdraw from the world. So it's got this regulating principle, sort of like breathing with the libidinal energies. The idea, Jung says, is to always remain in the center and to allow the four functions. So his four psychological functions, he says, are important: thinking, feeling, sensing, and perceiving. All four of those work together as ways to mediate and stay in balance and harmony between the center and the outside. So Jung suggests that the mandala is, rather than being a total withdrawal from life, is a certain inducement to living, whereby the individual can feel grounded in the center and then have these functions with which they've de-identified, where they use these functions as the mediator between self and world. And it's through this mediation that one both is induced to live, because it's not really me who's living, I'm living, or it's not really me who's being subject to sort of the torments of the world, it's these functions. And so I can be induced to living in that way, and I can also withdraw from the world in order to remain separate from it. So it's this sort of living, breathing. You can think of the mandala as a living, breathing sort of apparatus that represents the ideal libidinal flow of energy. Okay, so let's get then to Christiana's vision. She's the new vision in this part. She says, "I beheld a laughing goat, which led me down many steps into a black cavern." So remember, she's the tree, and she's kind of bridging in this transcendental way from gold to sun. And now she sees a goat that leads her into a dark cavern. So some associations we might have here is, on the one hand, the goat, recall, is sort of half of the god Pan. So Pan is this sexual perversion deity in popular mythology. When Christiana saw the god Pan, he was without any sex organs and also had I think a necklace, or he did the sign of the cross over her. So Pan, for Christiana, represents this spiritualized eros, where in the first term, she descended and saw this god who is the kind of perfect juxtaposition of suffering and joy together in this kind of animal nature, which has a spiritualized eros towards the world. So there's one sense in which the goat is kind of the object of desire that's leading her deeper into the world and to the realities of the world as suffering and joy. There's, of course, the general Dionysian reference, Dionysus being associated with ecstasis. Ecstasis being the same sort of experience of the duality of life contained within a single individual. The god Pan and the goat represent instinct. And in general, the goat is the object of eros, which is now which is leading Christiana into a dark cavern. And so psychologically, she's descending somewhere deeper into our unconscious that she previously had not been. So the next part of the vision, she says, "There I saw two large white snakes and a small black snake with green eyes." So let's just do a little bit of association with snakes. Snakes tend to be inhuman. They're cold. They can contain poison. Often it's associated in medicine, for example, with Asclepius, who has the sword. Jung comments, for example, that the doctor is the one who can control the poisons. And so these snakes contain some poison or some distillation or concentration of power that she's going to encounter here. So the vision continues. "The dark snake coiled around my left leg. I sought to tear it off, but I could not. Then the two white snakes approached me and put their heads close to my face. 'Who are you?' I asked them. They answered, 'We are night and day. We are good and evil. We are 2 eyes, 2 hands, your 2 feet.' Then I lay back in the darkness and ceased to struggle." So there's 3 snakes here. There's a black snake wrapped around her left leg, and there are 2 white snakes close to her face who are saying, "I am the opposites." But they're also saying, "I'm not really the opposites. Good and evil aren't really relevant here. I'm the same as your 2 eyes, your 2 hands, your 2 feet. While I might appear to be opposites, I'm really something else." Okay, so let's start with the end, where she talks about ceasing to struggle. So she ceases to struggle, Jung says, because she's coming from the place where she is grounded like a tree. So to trace some of these spiritual development things one last time, maybe. At first, there was the notion of ecstasis, where she encountered the spiritualized eros. There was then what I'm going to call metohi, metohi being the Greek for participation. So ecstasis is the Greek for to be beside oneself or to be outside oneself. And it's the idea that one experiences a consciousness which is other than itself. And this leads one to the possibility that there exists this collective unconscious, which is grounded in a hypostasis, that there are autonomous functions of our psyche from which we can de-identify. And the de-identification is kind of the consequence of the Mandala. We saw all this. Metohi, now I'm suggesting, is that very hypostasis with which we participate in the vegetative growth that we saw in the last couple lectures. Through the participation with the collective unconscious and this mandalic Taoistic approach to the world, we grow as a plant would grow in spiritual knowledge, wisdom, and the way we associate with the world. So part of what she's doing here then is she's participating in the world of creation that Jung and Demos argued about at the beginning of the lecture. So there's this darkness to the world. God's creative power is his darkness. And what Christiana is now in a position to do is, because of her experience of God in ecstasis, she's now in a position to participate in the very darkness of God's creation. And that's what I'm suggesting, and Jung to a large extent is suggesting is happening here. She's descending into the earth and growing like a plant. So this is part of the descent. The roots grow down into the earth, and she's now establishing roots. So as these roots grow, right, she encounters two snakes. And this is a trial that Jung says that she cannot escape. So the two white snakes represent the conscious ambivalences or the conscious rational opposites. Let's just move down a bit here. So the white snake are the opposites of equal value and valence. The dark snake on the left leg is the unconscious shadow. Now, as her roots grow down into the earth, she encounters the problem that what she had previously thought was good and evil are now two equally valent white snakes. So in her mind, this is the notion, is in her mind, in her consciousness, her rational deliberations about good and evil are now seen to be two snakes of the same color, essentially. So she has been, this is the notion in her conscious life, been arguing over semantics, essentially, where they're just two white snakes. But the real tension of opposites now is not in these rational deliberations, but it's between irrational deliberations and some dark shadow content. So the black snake is wrapped around her left leg, signifying this dark, concentrated, poisonous, potentially danger of her unconscious. So left being associated with unconscious or kind of unfavored. So now interpreting these three snakes together, the two white snakes represent the conscious presumption of harmony between opposites that are not really opposite. So she thinks she's balanced her life, but they're really just two snakes of the same color. The black snake represents the connection to the chaotic individuation forces of Luciferic disruption and possibly of God. And then the tension of the conscious rational deliberations are two sides of the same category, rational and objective. So the idea is that consciousness is a tension of opposites in some sense, but they are sort of rational objectifications of reality in a way that their deliberation really doesn't lead anywhere. And so this Luciferic power coming up from the left side, the dark snake from below, is a totally new category with which the conscious is now in opposition. It's the irrational and the subjective. And so the lecture ends with Jung suggesting that this rational, irrational, subjective side of things is sort of what comes up when one is trying to progress in their life. It's the acknowledgement of this dark force. He associates it with the past. And the notion, he says, that in primitive cultures, for example, they are deathly afraid of progress because what comes along with it is this subjectivity and kind of the long tail of history with which one is sort of ambivalently oriented because it's unknown. So what is the true meaning of the subjective past is kind of part of what he's getting at here. And so we'll pick that up next time.